Hi guys. So I started into the book of Romans, which it took me a few weeks to decide where to go because I haven't had to pick like a new book of the Bible for like 5 years or so. So to my shame, yes, I have been slacking here, but I went through stuff. So I'm back, which I'm happy about. So I finally settled on Romans because so much of what is going on in the world seems to be pointing back to Israel, and I think it could just get so confusing with all of the Zionist propaganda and what are Christians to really believe, what's the truth. And I think Paul in Romans lays that out pretty clearly for us, or at least that's what I have known in my studies. So I wanted to revisit that. It's been, I don't know, probably 20 years since I've studied Romans in depth, maybe 15, I don't remember. But anyway, it's been a long time. So anyway, I had opened with chapter 1 a couple days ago. Paul introduces himself as he always does when he writes, and so he's writing to the church in Rome, which, as we know, Rome was the political power of the time. So the people in Rome would have been, or the believers in Rome, he was writing to, and anyone else who might be influenced by his church and his letter there. They're obviously in a diverse place, a big city. And so that's the audience that we start with in Romans. So he's begun by telling them, this is who I am. I'm a servant of Christ. I'm a messenger sent to you with the message of the gospel. And he reminds them that the gospel is nothing to be ashamed of. Like, he himself leads by example and says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And there's a reason that he says that. So, anyway, we'll get into that. So, but he begins by saying, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I'm not ashamed to preach the gospel. And when you're in a big city, it would be like somebody sending a letter to a church in like Washington, D.C. or, New York City. And these people are living there. And so that's kind of what it's like. He's saying you're going to come up against a lot of differing people and viewpoints, but this is nothing to be ashamed of. But why would it be something to be ashamed of? There's a lot of lofty ideas out there, there's a lot of pride, especially metropolises and things of that nature. So he knows that the gospel itself is very simple. It's not easy, but it's simple and it's plain. And, it's about God coming down in the form of a baby to a farm, a stable, and dying at the hands of his own people and the Roman guard, which is, that's where they were in Rome. So Rome was essentially the political power that, killed Jesus. The Jews killed Jesus. It was his own people too. So, he knew that was going to elicit some response. Like, oh, you believe that? You believe in that guy? Like, he just got crucified by, our guard. So, that's, I think, one of the reasons that he starts out with, I'm not ashamed of this. And the reason that he tells us he's not ashamed is because the gospel is the power of God. So in Romans 1:24, he starts telling them why living by faith makes sense. So, interestingly, after he's done with his introductions and everything else, and why he's there and why he's not ashamed, when he begins into his discourse about teaching them, about the gospel, He begins with God's wrath. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? How many places do you go in church today and the preacher begins his sermon with God's wrath? But that's what Paul does. I think he had the right idea there. But why does he begin there? This is Paul's quote in the beginning here in verse 24, Romans 1:24. He says, God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Okay, so a couple things just with that beginning statement there. He says God's wrath is revealed. So that's interesting, right? He says that what can be known about God is plain because God has shown it to those who are suppressing the truth. So those who are not choosing God, who are choosing to live in their own way, he says, my wrath is revealed. They can see that. And what can be known about me is revealed. It's plain. Paul says that God's invisible attributes, now think about that, that's a little mind twister there, but his invisible attributes, things that God is, we can't see, but we know in our hearts because God has put it there in our hearts to know him. It says God's invisible attributes are clearly perceived and have been since the creation of the world. So in our hearts, we can perceive clearly who God is in his character without seeing him. That's what Paul says. So how? He says all of this is evident to humans in the things that have been made. Okay, in creation. We know who God is by looking out our window and seeing the sky, the grass, the trees, the animals, ourselves. We can see through everything that God has created, not only that he exists, but that he is good, okay? His attributes are generosity and love. We can see that through the creation. That's what Paul says. So, but apparently not all things about God can be known because he does make the distinction. What can be known about God is plain. So obviously what can't be known about God, we don't know because we're not him. So we can't fully understand him. But lots of things about God are obvious to everyone, not just believers. So our New Testament writer, Paul, tells us that his Roman readers, that he tells them, the people who deny the truth of God as his existence, people who say there's no God or, look at him wrongly like he's evil or something like that. People who do not deny God are in denial about reality altogether. Okay, he tells that if you look outside and you see everything God made in creation, not only is God's existence obvious, but his wrath is also obvious. That's interesting to note. He goes on and he says, even though God's attributes are invisible, human perception makes them very clear to us in our hearts. And this has been true since the origins of both man and earth. So God created it that way. That's what we're meant to do. We're meant to see God in what he has made, including inside ourselves. So therefore, Paul says, therefore, because of these realities, because you can know God by being in the world and recognizing creation as something that didn't just happen by itself, human beings are without excuse. Paul says, because we can know this, because we do know this, we're without excuse. There's no excuse to say there's no God. It's obvious. It's obvious. So he begins there. There's no excuse to deny that God exists. There's no excuse to deny the truth that he planted within our hearts about what is right and wrong. That's what's following. If we know there's God, which we do know, even if we won't admit that we know that, we know there's God. And the second thing that comes after that is we know what is right and wrong because it's been put into us. There's no excuse to fail to give him honor and thanks because we, by our very nature, as well as the nature that he gave us outside to look at, we know that he's the creator deserving of all of our worship. So these things, they don't seem that difficult, right? And I think that's another reason why Paul starts with don't be ashamed of this, because it's not like, again, it's not some lofty idea. It's not some complicated, complex thing that nobody can understand. This is easy. This is simple, right? You look outside, you know that somebody created that. It didn't just happen, right? Simple stuff. This is fundamental, right? But next, Paul goes into great detail about those who know these things are true, yet deny them on purpose. These are the people he's talking about. Paul says that those who know God exists, which should be everyone, as he's just stated, we should know that by looking outside, by looking at ourselves, by looking at how our bodies work, like there's a God, right? But the people who deny this and suppress this truth and fail to give thanks and fail to acknowledge him as the creator, he says they become futile in their thinking and their hearts become dark. So their thinking becomes vain. Like it's ineffective. What they're thinking doesn't amount to anything logical. It just goes down a rabbit hole to somewhere else that doesn't make any sense. So that's what happens to their thinking, even though they think they're wise, and their hearts become dark, which is, I think, the worst thing, right? That's worse. Your mind is one thing, but your heart is another. So, but both things happen when you deny the reality and the existence of a creator. But this is a conscious choice, Paul says, to deny the reality of the universe in which you live, right? So that's how he begins that. And he says that though these people claim they're wise, they're actually fools, which is kind of a shame because what he's really saying is, in other words, you can have as many letters after your name as you want. You can have all the education, all the books, everything. You can have head knowledge, right? You can have secular and worldly knowledge, but if you exchange your worship of a God and deny the existence of a creator that has made you and made his presence known to you, and exchange that for mere products of his creation, whether you're, worshiping, status or animals or money or people, whatever, the vice is, when you exchange the worship of God for the worship of things in the world, not only does your perception of reality dull, but your motivations, your inclinations, and all of your conclusions become compromised by that same foolishness. So that's a natural working out of what happens when you deny the existence of God. And then you add to that a heart that is not full of light and truth, but has become dark because of your conscious choice to deny God. And you find a remedy for all manner of evil and self-indulgent, sinful living. And that's how we get there. This is a life contrary to the one Paul began teaching us about when he opened Romans and to his Roman readers. And that is the life lived by faith. Okay, so that's contrary, obviously the opposite. So Paul says when people deny the truth of God, a truth that has been plainly revealed to all of us by creation, that they not only become fools, but God gives them up to their own lusts, and it's brought about by their darkened hearts. So all of these wrong things that people begin to do come from or stem from that darkened heart, that foolish, futile thinking that God has given them over to once they've said, okay, God doesn't exist or God isn't real or whatever. So, interestingly, when one exchanges God's obvious truth for lies in this way, God's solution is to give them over to a specific type of sin. He describes this punishment as dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. Now, what does that mean? He tells us. Paul describes exactly what he means by this type of sin. He calls them dishonorable passions. And he lists them as, this is what he lists them as, women exchanging natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. Men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves due penalty for their error. So what's Paul talking about? He's like, first you deny God exists, even though you know that he does. Then your heart is darkened and your mind is futile. And the next thing is sexual sin. And he's talking about homosexuality in this passage. So you can look at that. It's Romans 1:26 and 27. So as Paul concludes his opening statement on creation, human perception of God therein, deliberate human denial and the consequences of it, by telling his readers that when humans behave this way and do not consider it important to acknowledge God rightly, he, in large part, lets them go have their way. That's essentially what Paul is saying. Like, if you say to God, I choose not to deal with you. I know you're there, but I'm going to pretend like I don't believe in you, or say that you don't exist, or not follow you for whatever reason. These are the natural outworkings that happen after that. God says, okay, go do what you want, basically. We'll see how that goes for you. And he gives them over, it says, to do things that they ought not to do. And in their doing of the unrighteous deeds, he says, they receive in themselves the due penalty for that error. So this is an intentional error that they're making. Deliberately, they're choosing not to follow God or know God. And it says that they're being rewarded accordingly. So you can take that as you will. But basically, this is their choice, and it's not a pretty one. So we can all expect a consequence when we live in opposition to God. And so we know that to be true. So going on here a little bit, I'm not going to go too much further today, but he says, in addition to their homosexual lusts and deeds, their darkened hearts and debased minds will also become filled with all kinds of evil. Paul says, he makes a list, basically. He lists jealousy, malice, envy, murder, strife, deceit, gossip, slander, hatred of God, insolence, haughtiness, boastfulness, being disobedient to their parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, and ruthlessness as some of the attributes that you can expect to have when you deny God's existence or live apart from him. And we see this. I mean, we see it every day. We see it in ourselves when we choose not to agree with God about what is right and wrong, right? This is reaping what you sow. It's the first principle of the Bible. So it's good to keep that in mind, right? There's always a consequence when we disobey God. But Paul says that even though that these people who are living in opposition to God, and obviously, I mean, that's a lot of us on any given day, but he's talking about a specific group here who have completely thrown off the idea that God even exists. But he says that though they know the punishment for these deeds is death, and that they deserve that punishment, they continue to do the same things over and over. And they also approve of everyone else who's doing those things. So that's the opening chapter of Romans. Tomorrow I'm going to look at chapter 2, which it is kind of a continuation of this anyway, what he's already led into, but I didn't want to get too long today. But Paul does have something to say about judging other people. And I know that topic comes up a lot when we're especially talking about, homosexuality and things. Oh, you can't judge me and all that. Paul does, he does speak on that. And I think the difference, the kind of, the vision line that he makes is there's a difference between having the authority to judge or pass judgment on other people versus having the discernment and the ability to judge inappropriate behavior as such. So we need to be able to know how that difference looks and works. And obviously we only have one righteous judge, which is Jesus Christ. So Paul kind of hones in on the judgment portion of this topic, and I think that's good, but I didn't want to get too lengthy today. So we'll look at that next time. But just if you're going to take something with you from this particular chapter, I would say take with you the fact that Paul says that we are without excuse. We have no excuse for inappropriate, wrong behavior, because we have been given by God himself very clear and plain creation. All of creation shows us that he exists and who he is. His invisible attributes are clearly seen by us. That's what Paul says. So consider that. I hope you guys have a good day, and I hope this was helpful. See ya.